They told you those names on the old maps were accidents, little mistakes, bad ears, bad spelling. Nothing to see here. You've seen the explanation before. Europeans arrived on the coast of West Africa, heard African words like Heta, Sweta, Wider, and scribbled them down wrong. That's how Judah ended up on the map, they say. Just a misunderstanding. A coincidence. History's version of autocorrect. Sounds harmless, comfortable, clean. But here's the problem. That explanation only works if you ignore what Europeans believed at the time they wrote those maps. And belief always shows up in ink. Ask yourself this. When people label a place, are they guessing or revealing how they see the world? Because when you go back far enough, before modern race theory, before the whitening of everything sacred, Europe didn't imagine biblical people the way Sunday school posters show them today. They didn't picture pale figures glowing under stained glass, looking like they'd never seen the sun. They imagined something else entirely. And once you see that, the spelling mistake story starts to fall apart. Let's rewind. When the earliest European explorers, missionaries, and traders reached West Africa between the 1400s and 1700s, they didn't arrive with modern racial ideas. They hadn't yet decided who was supposed to be superior. They hadn't turned whiteness into a religion. They were carrying something older, a medieval worldview shaped by church art, scripture, and inherited memory. And in that worldview, the people of the Bible were not European. They were dark. Open a medieval Bible illustration from France, Italy, Spain, or the Byzantine world and you'll see it immediately. Prophets with brown skin, patriarchs with tightly curled hair, holy families painted in deep earth tones. Those famous black Madonnas scattered across Poland, France, and Russia, they're not soot-stained accidents. They are leftovers from a time when holiness still wore African features. Europe remembered this longer than they admit. So when Europeans stepped onto the shores of West Africa and encountered powerful societies, Akan, Yoruba, Igbo, Edo, Fon, Wolof, Mande, they didn't see pagans the way later colonizers would. They saw echoes, complex priesthoods, ritual law, purification rites, sacred calendars, naming traditions, food restrictions, clan structures. It felt familiar. And when humans see familiarity, they reach for language that already exists in their mind. That's where the Bible comes in. Early missionaries and travelers wrote openly about it. They compared West African customs to Old Testament practices, not metaphorically, practically. They weren't trying to flatter Africans. They were trying to explain what they were seeing. So when they sat down to draw maps, they didn't do it in a cultural vacuum. Maps are not neutral. They are belief systems drawn with borders, which brings us back to that name, Judah. Not Weta, not Heta, not some phonetically safe guess. Judah, the royal tribe, the lineage of David, the house of Solomon. Ask yourself why that word came so easily to their pens, because here's the part they don't like to connect. Those same historians who tell you Judah on the map is just a coincidence will also admit something else in a different chapter. That Europeans widely believe West Africans were connected to biblical peoples. They just never let those two facts touch. They keep them in separate rooms, different paragraphs, different footnotes, because once you let them meet, the story changes. You start to realize that Judah wasn't written because Europeans misunderstood African speech. It was written because Europeans were interpreting African identity. Even linguistically, the excuse is thin. Europeans mispronounced African names all the time and still didn't turn them into biblical labels. They heard Ndongo and wrote Angola, heard Congo and wrote Congo, heard Benin and kept it Benin. No Bible required, but in one of the most symbolically charged regions of West Africa, they reached for Judah. That's not random, that's memory talking. And memory is dangerous because it reminds you that before history got cleaned up, before faces got repainted, before Africa got pushed to the margins, Europe saw black people as part of the sacred story, not outside it, which raises an uncomfortable question. If Judah on the map was just a mistake, why did Europe work so hard later to erase the belief system that made that mistake make sense? Because once Europe changed the image, it had to change the memory. That's the part most people never sit with. You can't whiten the Bible without first severing Africa from it, and you can't do that unless you pretend the earlier connections never existed. So Europe didn't just revise paintings, they revised belief. But before that, revision. The record is embarrassingly clear. Early European theology did not place Israelites in Northern Europe. It placed them in a world that touched Africa, lived beside Africa, and often looked like Africa. Read medieval Christian commentary on the Song of Solomon and you'll see it. I am black but comely wasn't treated as poetry. It was treated as description. When European artists painted Moses, Miriam, Aaron, David, they didn't give them rosy cheeks and flaxen hair. They painted them with deep brown skin, sometimes nearly black. The catacombs of Rome still hold early Christian figures painted in tones that modern eyes would label African without hesitation. Byzantine icons of Christ and the apostles are dark enough to shatter every modern stereotype. And again, those black Madonnas didn't appear in one place. They appeared everywhere. That matters, because shared imagery across centuries doesn't happen by accident. It happens because a civilization agrees on what something looks like. So when Europeans encountered Africans in West Africa, they weren't starting from zero. They were matching what they saw to what they already believed. That's why early travel accounts don't sound confused. They sound confident. Missionaries wrote about purification laws that reminded them of Leviticus, about circumcision practiced without European prompting, about priestly classes set apart from the general population, about sacred objects treated with reverence and restriction. This wasn't projection after the fact. It was recognition in real time. And recognition is dangerous when it contradicts the future you plan to build. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. When Europeans labeled that region Judah, they weren't just naming land. They were placing people inside a biblical genealogy. And genealogy equals legitimacy, which becomes a problem once Europe decides it wants exclusive ownership over civilization, scripture, and moral authority. You can't rule the world while admitting the people you're conquering might be connected to the same sacred lineage you claim. So the memory had to go. But before it did, Europeans wrote too much down. In 1670, the Royal English cosmographer John Ogilby published a massive atlas simply titled Africa. This wasn't a fringe pamphlet. It was an official work for educated Europe. And in it, Ogilby made a statement that should have ended the debate forever. He wrote that along the Niger River lived people who claimed descent from Abraham. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Descent. Let that sit. A 17th century European scholar recording Africans identifying with Abraham centuries before modern race science made that idea impossible. And he wasn't alone. More than a century earlier, Portuguese Archbishop Dom Gaspar de Leão wrote about what he called the Black Jews of Guinea. That phrase didn't cause outrage at the time. It didn't need explanation, because within that earlier worldview, it made sense. European writers repeated it for generations, not as legend, as category, a people they believed existed. But then the ground shifted. By the late 1700s, Europe began reorganizing the world around race, not religion, not theology, race. And once that happened, Africa had to be repositioned as outside the biblical narrative. That's when the cleanup began. Ancient Egypt was slowly repainted, Moors were reclassified, Hebrews were relocated in the imagination, and suddenly, Judah on the map became inconvenient, so it had to be reframed as a coincidence. Here's what they didn't expect. In the 1780s, a French Enlightenment scholar named Constantin François de Volney traveled through Egypt and studied its monuments closely, not through myth, through measurement. And what he concluded shook Europe. The ancient Egyptians, he said, were true black Africans, the same type as the native people of the continent. That single observation cracked everything open, because if Egypt was African, and if Hebrews lived among Egyptians, learned in their courts, fled from their land, and were often mistaken for them, then the distance between Africa and Israel collapses, culturally, physically, spiritually, which means those early European associations weren't fantasies. They were logical. Put it all together. Africans along the Niger claiming Abrahamic descent, European officials referencing black Jews in Guinea, scholars identifying Egypt as African. This wasn't Afrocentric revisionism. This was Europe telling the truth before it changed its mind. And once you see that, the Judah label stops looking like an error. It starts looking like a confession. So ask yourself, if Europe once saw Africa as central to the biblical world, what exactly terrified them enough to make them erase it? Because once Africa was placed at the center, Europe couldn't sit on the throne alone. That's the real fear. It wasn't about maps. It wasn't about spelling. It was about control. History only gets rewritten when the old version threatens power. And by the late 1700s into the 1800s, Europe was building a new world order, an order that required hierarchy, clear lines, permanent winners and permanent losers. Biblical legitimacy was currency. If Africans were part of that sacred lineage, then the moral math stopped working. So the story had to be re-engineered. But before we get to the erasure, you need to understand just how normal the African Israelite connection once felt to Europeans. This wasn't fringe thinking tucked away in footnotes. It was mainstream. Early Christian theology placed the biblical world inside an Afro-Asiatic continuum, not Europe. Maps of the Holy Land sat closer to Africa than to Rome in the medieval imagination. Ethiopia wasn't a metaphor. It was scripture. Psalm 68 wasn't read symbolically. Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God was taken literally. That's why medieval churches across Europe featured Ethiopian figures in sacred scenes, not as background characters, as central participants. So when Europeans encountered African kingdoms with organized religion, advanced governance, and moral law, they weren't shocked. They were validated. Their theology had prepared them for it, which makes the Judah label even more revealing. Because Judah wasn't just any tribe. Judah was kingship, authority, inheritance. That's the name they chose to write in ink, not Levi, not Dan, Judah. And names are choices, especially when you're drawing a map meant to guide future generations. Here's what the coincidence argument never explains. If Europeans were simply mishearing African words, why did they consistently choose biblical terms only when it came to West Africa, and not anywhere else? Why didn't East African regions get renamed after Israelite tribes? Why didn't Southern African kingdoms suddenly become Reuben or Naphtali on European charts? Because West Africa held something different. It was economically powerful, politically organized, spiritually coherent. It mattered. And meaning attracts interpretation. That's why French maps labeled the coast Judea. Portuguese maps used Judah. Dutch traders wrote Kingdom of Judah without apology. Multiple languages, multiple nations, same word. That's not sloppy spelling. That's shared belief. But shared beliefs don't survive power shifts. By the 19th century, Europe had decided who history belonged to, and Africa wasn't invited. So earlier records became dangerous. Paintings were reinterpreted. Descriptions were softened. Associations were dismissed. Judah turned into just phonetics. And the people who once recorded African connections to scripture began acting like those records never existed. Here's the psychological trick. When you want to erase something, you don't attack it directly. You make it sound boring. You drain it of meaning. You say, there's no mystery here, because mystery invites investigation. But boredom makes people move on. That's why modern textbooks mention the old maps briefly, if at all, and immediately neutralize them. No discussion, no context, no belief analysis, just misheard word, and keep flipping pages. But the archives don't agree. Travel accounts from the 1600s repeatedly describe West African communities keeping the customs of Israel. That phrase shows up again and again, not because Africans said, "We are Israelites," in modern terms, but because Europeans recognized patterns they associated with Israel. They saw structured law, ritual purity, covenant-style community obligations. They didn't invent those observations centuries later. They wrote them down on the spot, which means the Judah label didn't come from ignorance. It came from interpretation. And interpretation reveals mindset. The tragedy is what happened next. Once Europe committed to racial hierarchy, African proximity to scripture became unacceptable. So the narrative flipped. Suddenly, Africans were outside history, outside religion, outside civilization, and all the earlier evidence had to be reframed to fit the new world view. That's why this subject makes people uncomfortable, because it exposes something modern history relies on: amnesia, selective forgetting. So here's the question they don't want you to ask. If Europe truly believed Africans were unrelated to the biblical world, why did they need centuries of erasure to make that belief stick? Because erasure only happens when the original story is too loud to ignore. If Africa had truly been irrelevant to the biblical world, there would have been nothing to erase. No paintings to repaint, no maps to explain away, no travel accounts to quietly sideline. But that's not what we see. What we see is effort, and effort reveals fear. By the time Europe entered the 19th century, the narrative had to be airtight. Empire demanded certainty. Hierarchy demanded simplicity. So history was flattened. Complexity was the enemy. Earlier European voices, the ones who recorded African connections to scripture, were suddenly treated like curiosities instead of authorities. Their words didn't disappear. They were just reclassified. Outdated, symbolic, misinterpreted. That's how you bury something without burning it. But if you follow the paper trail instead of the polished textbooks, the older worldview keeps leaking through. Take European cartography itself. Maps were not scientific tools in the modern sense. They were moral documents. They reflected how a civilization ordered humanity. When a map maker labeled a region Judah, he wasn't just naming land. He was assigning identity. That label would have been reared by kings, merchants, clergy, and future explorers. It shaped expectations before anyone ever arrived, which makes the dismissal even stranger, because if Judah truly meant nothing, it wouldn't have survived on maps across multiple generations and empires. Cartographers copied one another carefully. Errors were corrected, names were debated, and yet Judah stayed. Why? Because it aligned with what Europeans already believed about West Africa. Beliefs don't vanish overnight. They get overwritten. And overwriting takes time. That's why even as racial theory hardened, cracks remained. European scholars in the 1700s still struggled to reconcile what they'd inherited with what they were now expected to believe. Volney wasn't alone. Other Enlightenment thinkers quietly admitted that ancient civilizations didn't look European at all. They just didn't know what to do with that information, because accepting it would have required rewriting the moral foundation of empire. So instead, a new solution emerged. Africa would be recast as ahistorical, not ancient, not sacred, not foundational, primitive. That single move solved everything. If Africa had no history, then earlier records could be treated as misunderstandings. If Africans were new to civilization, then they couldn't possibly be part of ancient scripture. Problem solved, except the evidence refused to cooperate. Church art still existed. Maps still existed. Manuscripts still existed. So the final step was psychological, disconnection. Modern readers would be trained to see each piece in isolation. Paintings as art, not theology. Maps as geography, not belief. Travel accounts as anecdotes, not testimony. Once you separate the evidence, the pattern disappears. But when you reunite it, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Early Europe didn't see Africa as outside the biblical story. They saw it woven into it. That's why the Judah label mattered. It wasn't about language. It was about lineage. And lineage threatened systems built on exclusion. That's the part that still echoes today. Because modern discomfort around this topic doesn't come from lack of evidence. It comes from what the evidence implies. If Africans were part of the biblical narrative as early Europeans believed, then the modern image of who belongs collapses, which is why the pushback is always emotional, not factual. Overreach, revisionism, agenda. Those are not arguments, they're defenses. Defenses against a memory that refuses to stay buried. And here's the quiet irony. The people who erased this history preserved it at the same time. They left it in archives, in cathedral walls, in old atlases. They assumed no one would go back and read it seriously. They didn't account for curiosity. They didn't account for technology. They didn't account for people who would connect the dots instead of accepting the summary. So when you look at those old maps today, don't look at them the way modern historians tell you to. Look at them the way their creators did, as reflections of belief. Because once you do that, Judah stops being an accident. It becomes evidence. And evidence raises the next uncomfortable question. If Europe erased Africa's place in the biblical world on purpose, what else did they remove that we're only now starting to notice? Because Judah was never meant to stand alone. That's what makes the erasure so obvious. Once you stop treating that name like an isolated error and start viewing it inside the wider pattern, something else emerges. Consistency. The same Europe that labeled West Africa. Judah also filled its churches, manuscripts, and theology with African presence. That presence wasn't symbolic, it was structural. Take Ethiopia. For medieval Europe, Ethiopia wasn't a vague place somewhere south. It was a sacred anchor. The Bible mentioned it by name. Church fathers wrote about it with reverence. Kings sent envoys to it. The Ethiopian monarch was believed to descend from Solomon himself, not as legend, as lineage. So when Europeans encountered African kingdoms that reflected biblical order, Ethiopia wasn't an abstract comparison. It was precedent. That's why African people weren't seen as strangers to scripture in early European thought. They were seen as older participants, and age implies authority, which becomes a problem if you're trying to establish yourself as the sole inheritor of civilization. This is where memory starts to get dangerous, because memory connects dots, and connected dots tell stories power doesn't control. Early Europeans didn't just compare West Africans to Israelites culturally, they compared them spiritually. They wrote about Africans possessing deep moral law, about communal justice, about reverence for covenant. That's not how you describe a people you believe are. Outside sacred history, that's how you describe relatives, which makes the later shift even more violent because it wasn't gradual misunderstanding, it was abrupt disinheritance. Africa went from ancestor to outsider in a few generations, and that doesn't happen organically, it happens deliberately. The invention of racial hierarchy required clean boundaries, no blurred lines, no shared lineage, no overlapping sacred space. So Africa had to be pushed out, which meant earlier European admissions had to be neutralized, not disproven, explained away. That's why the Judah debate matters, because it exposes the mechanics of erasure. If scholars can convince you that something meaningful is just coincidence, they don't have to argue the larger issue. They shut the door before the conversation begins. But coincidence has limits. Coincidence doesn't repeat across nations, languages, and centuries. Coincidence doesn't align with theology, art, and testimony. Coincidence doesn't survive editing, yet Judah did, which suggests it was anchored in belief strong enough to persist until belief itself changed. And belief did change. By the 1800s, Europeans had reconstructed the biblical image entirely. Sacred figures were repainted lighter. Biblical lands were visually detached from Africa. Genealogy was quietly rerouted northward. The result was a new myth presented as ancient truth. And once that myth hardened, everything that contradicted it became suspicious, including the people asking questions. That's why modern reactions are so defensive, because this isn't just about history, it's about identity. If Africa was once central to the biblical imagination, then modern exclusion isn't natural, it's artificial. And artificial systems collapse when exposed, which brings us to the part few want to acknowledge. The erasure didn't just distort the past, it reshaped the present. When Africa was removed from sacred history, Africans were removed from moral authority. That made exploitation easier, dehumanization easier, justification easier. You can't do that to someone you see as part of your spiritual family. So the family tree was cut, and Judah had to become a typo. But the old memory never fully disappeared. It lingered in whispers, in art, in forbidden scholarship, and now it's resurfacing. Not because of ideology, but because evidence doesn't stay buried forever. So here's the question that keeps surfacing. If Europe once believed Africa belonged inside the biblical world and later erased that belief to serve power, what version of history are we actually living with now? A version designed to feel finished. That's the trick. A finished story discourages curiosity. An open story invites investigation. Modern history presents itself as settled, debates closed, footnotes final. But real history never behaves that way. It leaks. And when it leaks, the same pressure points keep appearing. Africa, scripture, identity. The Judah label is one leak, not because it proves everything on its own, but because it connects to everything else. Once you see it, you start noticing how carefully modern narratives avoid the early European worldview. They skip over it quickly. They summarize instead of quote. They paraphrase instead of engage. Because engagement opens doors, and doors lead to rooms they don't want entered. Let's talk about timing. The shift away from Africa-centered biblical memory didn't happen in antiquity. It happened during empire, during expansion, during extraction, during justification. That's not coincidence. When Europe needed moral permission to dominate the world, Africa's sacred status became inconvenient. So a new hierarchy was installed. Scripture stayed sacred, but its image changed. Suddenly, holiness had a look, and that look wasn't African, but earlier Europe hadn't thought that way. Earlier Europe didn't need to. Their world wasn't yet organized around racial ownership, which is why they could look at West Africa and see echoes of Israel instead of obstacles to empire. So when modern scholars dismiss Judah as accidental, they're not just simplifying history. They're protecting a narrative that requires Africa to be absent, because once Africa is present, the questions multiply. Why did Europeans recognize biblical patterns in African societies? Why did they paint holy figures dark? Why did they describe Africans using scriptural language? And most importantly, why did all of that stop? Those are dangerous questions, because answers expose motive. Here's something else worth sitting with. The people who wrote Judah on those maps didn't see themselves as inventing something new. They believed they were discovering something old. That's the difference. They weren't imposing identity. They thought they were uncovering it, which means they believed Africa already belonged to the sacred story. They were naming what they thought existed. That's a very different posture from later colonial arrogance, and it tells you something about the intellectual rupture that followed. By the 19th century, Europe no longer wanted discovery. It wanted dominance. Discovery complicates hierarchy. Dominance requires certainty. So ambiguity had to be removed. That's why nuance vanished from history books. That's why earlier European writers are rarely quoted directly anymore. Their words are inconvenient. They don't fit, but they're still there. And when you read them without the modern filter, the tone is unmistakable. They weren't skeptical. They weren't mocking. They were matter of fact. This people keeps the customs of Israel, not speculation, observation. Which brings us back to the core issue. Modern audiences are trained to treat Africa as peripheral to global history, peripheral to religion, peripheral to civilization, peripheral to identity. That training didn't come from evidence. It came from repetition. Say something long enough and it becomes common sense. But common sense isn't truth. It's habit. And habits can be broken. That's why these conversations feel disruptive. They interrupt a mental loop. They force reconsideration. And reconsideration threatens comfort. So resistance shows up. But resistance is not refutation. It's reaction. Which leaves us with a choice. We can accept the finished story, the clean, convenient one, and move on. Or we can follow the leaks, follow the names on the maps, follow the paintings, follow the testimony. Because once you do, the image changes. Africa doesn't sit outside the biblical world. It stands inside it, not as an afterthought, as foundation. And if that's true, what does that mean for everything built on the assumption that it wasn't? And this is where the silence gets loud. Because once Africa is placed inside the biblical world, the modern hierarchy doesn't just wobble, it collapses. That's why the conversation always gets redirected. Notice how quickly people rush to linguistics, phonetics, spelling errors. anything technical enough to drain the meaning out of the question. Because if they can make it about letters, they don't have to make it about power. But history isn't just what words sound like, it's what people meant when they wrote them. And meaning is shaped by worldview. So let's talk about worldview again. Specifically, who was allowed to be ancient? For centuries, Europe believed antiquity lived south and east, not north and west. Wisdom came from Africa and Asia. Europe was the student. That's not controversial. That's medieval Europe admitting its place in the world. Greek philosophers studied in Egypt. Christianity came through Africa before it reached Europe in Wanuntuandindao, force. Early church fathers referenced African theologians without apology. Africa wasn't a footnote, it was source code. So when Europeans encountered West Africa, they didn't see a blank slate. They saw continuity. They saw organized societies where law wasn't optional, where religion wasn't decorative, where ancestry mattered. Those are the markers Europeans associated with biblical civilization. And when humans see patterns, they label them. That's how cognition works. Judah wasn't scribbled by accident. It was selected because Judah meant something. It meant covenant. It meant kingship. It meant legitimacy before God. Those meanings didn't disappear overnight. They had to be dismantled. And dismantling required a new story. A story where Africa had no past worth mentioning. A story where sacred lineage ran exclusively through Europe. A story where earlier associations were confused, but confusion doesn't explain confidence. Those early map makers weren't uncertain. They didn't write maybe Judah. They didn't add question marks. They wrote it plainly. That confidence tells you they expected others to understand exactly what they meant. And for a long time, people did. It's only after racial ideology hardens that the meaning becomes unclear. That timing matters because it shows interpretation didn't change due to new evidence. It changed due to new priorities. And new priorities always leave fingerprints. One fingerprint is selective quotation. Modern historians love to reference early European travel accounts, just not the parts about scripture, lineage, or resemblance. Those passages get trimmed, summarized, softened, not denied, just minimized. Because denial invites debate. Minimization ends conversation. Another fingerprint is tone policing. The moment Africa and the Bible are mentioned together, the language shifts. Careful, speculative, overstated. That caution rarely appears when discussing European antiquity. Because European antiquity isn't threatening. African antiquity is. It disrupts assumptions. And assumptions are the real inheritance being protected. This isn't about proving every West African society descended from Israel. That's a distraction. The real issue is acknowledging that Europe once believed Africans belonged inside the biblical narrative. That belief existed. It was widespread, and it influenced how Europeans interpreted what they saw. Judah on the map is evidence of that mindset. You don't have to stretch it. You just have to stop shrinking it, because shrinking evidence is also a form of distortion. So when people ask, why does this matter today? Here's the answer. It matters because identity doesn't start in the present. It's inherited. And when inheritance is stolen, confusion follows. The erasure of Africa from sacred history didn't just rewrite the past. It shaped how Africans were treated afterward. If you're seen as outside the sacred story, you can be exploited without guilt. If you're seen as outside moral lineage, your suffering becomes manageable. That's not accidental. That's design. And once you see that design, Judah stops being trivia. It becomes a crack in the wall, a place where the older story leaks through. So the question becomes unavoidable. If early Europe saw Africa as part of the biblical family and later worked to forget it, what would happen if that memory fully returned? It would force a reckoning. That's what memory does when it comes back whole. Because remembering Africa's place in the biblical world doesn't just add information. It rearranges hierarchy. And hierarchy is the one thing modern history is desperate to protect. Think about how stories are usually told. There's always an origin point, a chosen people, a rightful heir. Once that role is claimed, everyone else gets measured against it. So when Africa was quietly removed from the sacred origin story, Europe didn't just gain status, it gained exclusivity. Scripture became inheritance instead of shared memory. An inheritance can be guarded, but shared memory can't. That's why this topic creates such friction. It's not about whether every detail lines up perfectly, it's about what Europe assumed before it decided what Africa should be. An assumption shapes action. Early Europeans didn't arrive in West Africa believing they were meeting people outside divine history. They believed they were encountering people who reflected it. That belief influenced how they described Africans, how they categorized them, how they mapped them. Judah is one of those categories, not alone, but revealing, because categories don't form without mental frameworks, and frameworks don't exist without prior stories. The prior story was Afro-Asiatic. Africa wasn't peripheral, it was ancestral, which is why the later shift feels so violent. It required tearing Africa out of a narrative it had occupied for centuries, and tearing causes damage. Damage to truth, damage to identity, damage to memory. This is where the psychological cost shows up. When a people are removed from sacred history, they're often taught to doubt their own worth. Not explicitly, systemically. It seeps into imagery, into education, into expectation. And that doubt doesn't just hurt the erased, it distorts the eraser too. Because a civilization that rewrites its past loses honesty. It becomes defensive, rigid, fragile. That fragility is what you're seeing whenever this subject comes up. The reaction isn't calm dismissal. It's panic disguised as professionalism. Because deep down, something is being threatened. Not facts, identity. The identity of who gets to be central, who gets to inherit wisdom, who gets to define holiness. That's why Judah can't just be left alone. It has to be explained away, minimized, neutralized. But explanation isn't the same as understanding. Understanding requires context, and the context is clear. Early Europe saw Africa through a biblical lens that included African people as participants, not outsiders. That lens only shattered once Europe needed Africa to be something else, something exploitable, something inferior. That's when scripture got repainted, that's when genealogy got rerouted, that's when Judah became a typo instead of a worldview. And here's the part no one likes to say out loud. Modern discomfort with this topic isn't rooted in evidence, it's rooted in consequence. If Africa belonged to the sacred story, then the story of modern domination collapses. If Africa belonged, then exclusion wasn't destiny, it was decision. And decisions carry responsibility, which is why the simplest move is denial. Coincidence, misheard word, overinterpretation. Say it fast enough, and most people won't look deeper. But you're not most people, you stayed, which means you felt the tension, that sense that something doesn't add up, that history feels edited, because it is, and edits leave seams. Judah is one seam, not because it proves everything, but because it opens everything. It invites the question modern history avoids. What if Africa was never meant to be outside the biblical world, but was pushed out to make room for someone else? If that's true, then the most dangerous lie isn't denial, it's normalization. Because once a false story becomes normal, questioning it feels radical. That's how control lasts. And nowhere is that clearer than in how people are taught to react to evidence like this. Not with curiosity, with discomfort, not with investigation, with dismissal. The goal isn't to disprove, it's to discourage. Because discouraged people don't dig, they accept summaries. And summaries are easy to manage. So let's slow this down and strip the emotion away for a moment. Not to soften the truth, but to sharpen it. What we are seeing isn't a conspiracy in the cartoon sense, it's something much more human. Narrative adaptation. Europe inherited a worldview that placed Africa inside sacred history. Then, Europe built an empire that couldn't survive that worldview. So the worldview changed. That's not mysterious. That's strategy. The problem is what happens afterward. Once the story changes, the old evidence becomes embarrassing, so it gets reinterpreted. Judah isn't wrong, it's misleading. Paintings aren't literal, they're symbolic. Travel accounts aren't testimony, They're confused impressions. Notice the pattern. Nothing is erased outright. Everything is softened until it loses force. That's how power edits history without leaving fingerprints. But fingerprints remain if you know where to look. And one of the clearest fingerprints is consistency. Consistency across mediums, maps, art, theology, travel writing, different authors, different countries, different centuries, same assumptions. Africans resembling biblical peoples. Africans practicing laws reminiscent of scripture. Africans being named with biblical categories. That doesn't happen in isolation. It happens because a civilization shares mental models, and mental models don't disappear overnight. They get replaced. Which brings us to the modern moment. Why is this resurfacing now? Because information no longer has a single gatekeeper. Paintings once locked in cathedrals are digitized. Manuscripts once buried in archives are searchable. Maps once reserved for elites are shared online. The walls are thinner, and when walls thin, suppressed memory breathes. People are seeing the contradictions for themselves. They're noticing that the older sources don't match the story they were taught, and once that doubt sets in, it spreads. Not because of ideology, because of pattern recognition. Humans are wired to notice when something doesn't fit, and this doesn't fit, which is why modern resistance feels frantic, not reason. Because reason would require engagement, and engagement would require admission. Admission that Africa's removal from sacred history wasn't discovery, it was redesign, and redesign implies intent. Which brings us to the question beneath all of this. Why was it so important to move Africa out of the biblical center? Because sacred proximity confers dignity, and dignity limits domination. You can conquer land, you can exploit labor, but it's much harder to morally justify doing that to people you see as spiritual kin. So the kinship had to be broken, and Judah had to become a typo. That's not about linguistics, that's about legitimacy, which means this conversation isn't finished. It can't be, because unfinished business always resurfaces. And history that's been edited always creates pressure. Pressure in identity, pressure in culture, pressure in self-perception. That's why this subject doesn't stay academic, it becomes personal. Because when people realize they were written out of a sacred story on purpose, the reaction isn't curiosity, it's anger, then grief, then resolve. And resolve changes things. So here's the question that history still hasn't answered. If Africa's exclusion from the biblical world was a deliberate redesign, who benefits from keeping that redesign intact today? Follow the benefit and the structure reveals itself, because narratives don't survive for centuries unless they serve someone. The modern version of history, the one where Africa sits outside sacred origin stories, doesn't just exist by accident. It props up an entire worldview, a worldview where authority flows in one direction, where legitimacy has a single lineage, where ownership of truth feels inherited, not shared. That's who benefits. And once you understand that, the defensiveness makes sense. This isn't about maps anymore. It's about permission. Permission to define civilization. Permission to define holiness. Permission to define who belongs at the center and who orbits the edges. Early Europe didn't need that permission. They weren't trying to own the story yet. So they could afford honesty. They could admit Africa's proximity to scripture. They could paint holy figures dark. They could label West African land Judah without panic. But empire changes priorities. Once Europe decided it was the destination instead of the student, it needed exclusive claims. And exclusive claims require exclusion. Africa couldn't be ancient and subordinate at the same time, so ancient Africa had to disappear. Not by destruction, by reinterpretation. This is where modern scholarship often plays, defense without realizing it. By insisting on neutrality, it preserves the revised story. By avoiding motive, it protects outcome. Because motive is where things get uncomfortable. Motive forces us to ask not just what changed, but why. And the why is simple. Control. Control over narrative. Control over identity. Control over inheritance. That's why even today, suggestions that Africa belonged inside the biblical world trigger alarm. Not because they're unfounded, but because they're destabilizing. They remove monopoly. They introduce shared origin, and shared origin undermines hierarchy, which brings us to the quiet truth beneath the outrage. The fear isn't that Africa was part of the sacred story. The fear is what happens if people accept that again, because acceptance changes posture. It changes how people see themselves, and people who see themselves as inheritors don't ask for permission. They claim space. That's what memory does when it's restored, and that's why erasure has to be maintained, not aggressively, subtly, through education that never quite connects the dots, through explanations that feel complete but aren't, through discouragement masked as professionalism. But systems built on a mission are fragile. They crack when pressure is applied, and pressure is building because people are comparing notes. They're reading the old sources. They're noticing the disconnect between what early Europeans wrote and what modern summaries say they meant. And once that gap is seen, it can't be unseen. Judah is part of that gap, not alone, but symbolic. It represents a time before the rewrite, a time when Europe hadn't yet decided Africa needed to be small, which makes the present moment dangerous for the old narrative, because we're not relying on reinterpretation anymore. We're looking directly at the evidence, at the paintings, at the maps, at the words, unfiltered. And unfiltered history is rarely polite. It disrupts comfort. It challenges inheritance. It forces recalibration, which brings us to the next layer. What happens after memory returns? Because awareness isn't the end of the process. It's the beginning. Once people realize they were edited out of sacred history, the question shifts. Not, was this true? But, why didn't they want us to know? And that question doesn't stop at maps. It moves forward into institutions, into education, into culture, because erasure never happens in just one place. So here's the pressure point. If Africa's biblical connection was removed to serve empire, what other truths were sacrificed to keep that empire standing? Once that question lands, it doesn't stay contained, it spreads. Because if one pillar of the story was altered, others start to wobble. People begin revisiting assumptions they were told were settled, not angrily, not emotionally, methodically. And methodical revision is far more dangerous than outrage, because outrage can be dismissed, evidence cannot. This is where the resistance intensifies, not in open debate, but in tone. Suddenly, curiosity becomes agenda. Questions become bias. Patterns become coincidence. The goal isn't to refute the evidence, it's to exhaust the person asking, to make the inquiry feel socially costly. That tactic has a long history. Gatekeeping rarely announces itself as censorship. It wears the mask of professionalism. But the cracks are widening. Because the digital age broke the old monopoly, you no longer need institutional permission to access primary sources. You don't need a credential to read a 16th century map. You don't need an intermediary to see how often Africa appears inside the sacred imagination of early Europe. And once access expands, control contracts. That's the shift we're living through, which is why the conversation feels volatile right now. Volatility isn't confusion, it's recalibration. The old framework can't fully hold anymore, but the new one hasn't stabilized yet. So tension fills the gap, and in that tension, something revealing happens. People start defending conclusions more fiercely than evidence. That's always a signal. When conclusions become sacred, history has stopped being history. It's become identity protection. And this is where the Judah maps become radioactive, because they sit at the intersection of faith, race, and power. They're not just geographical artifacts, they're psychological ones. They remind Europe of a time before whiteness hardened into doctrine, before biblical ancestry became racially exclusive, before Africa was forced into permanent antiquity without inheritance. That's the discomfort. Not that the maps exist, but that they existed first, and first matters. First establishes baseline. Everything after becomes reaction, which reframes modern denial as defensive rather than objective. This isn't about accuracy alone, it's about legacy. Because if Africa belonged at the center of sacred memory, then Europe's later claims aren't original. They're inherited. And inherited claims are fragile when the inheritance is shared. That's why the story had to be narrowed, simplified, stripped of ambiguity. Ambiguity empowers questions. Certainty shuts them down. But certainty requires maintenance, and maintenance requires repetition, which is why textbooks rarely mention what early Europeans believed. They skip straight to modern racial assumptions as if they were always there, as if whiteness was ancient, as if medieval Europe looked at scripture the way modern Europe does. It didn't. And that omission isn't accidental. It protects continuity, because continuity creates legitimacy. If beliefs appear unbroken, they feel inevitable. But inevitability collapses when rupture is revealed, and rupture is everywhere in the record. From art that suddenly changes skin tones, from theology that suddenly reinterprets literal descriptions as metaphor, from maps that suddenly don't mean what they say. Each shift has a moment. Each moment has a motive. And motives tell stories historians often avoid, because motives implicate systems, and systems implicate beneficiaries, which leads us to the deeper realization. This isn't about proving Africans were Israelites. That framing misses the point. The point is that early Europeans believed Africans were connected to biblical lineage. That belief shaped their mapping, their writing, their art, and belief matters, even when it's later rejected, because belief leaves residue. And Judah is residue. It's the fossil of a worldview that predates racial hierarchy, a worldview Europe later abandoned, but never fully erased. That's why traces keep resurfacing, in maps, in manuscripts, in paintings no longer displayed. The past keeps speaking. The question is whether we're willing to listen without forcing it into modern categories. Because modern categories weren't there when the ink dried, which brings us to a hard truth. You don't have to accept every claim to acknowledge the pattern. You don't have to rewrite theology to recognize historical memory. You only have to be honest about what early Europeans thought, and honesty is what destabilizes the polished narrative, because it shows that Africa was never outside. It was edited out. There's a difference. Outside implies exclusion by nature. Edited out implies removal by choice, and choices can be questioned. That's why this conversation keeps coming back, no matter how often it's dismissed, because the evidence doesn't disappear. It accumulates, and accumulation creates weight. Eventually, weight demands reevaluation, which leaves us with one final pivot. If the past was altered to serve power, what responsibility does the present have to correct it? Not emotionally, not ideologically, historically. Because truth delayed isn't truth denied forever. It just waits, and it's waiting now. So here we are, at the edge of everything we were taught. Maps that once seemed like trivial mistakes suddenly carry weight. Names inked across the coast of West Africa are no longer accidents. They are echoes, echoes of belief. Belief that Africa wasn't peripheral, that Africa was central, that Africans shared the same spiritual memory Europe later claimed for itself alone. And those echoes don't just whisper in libraries. They shout in cathedrals. They glare from the pages of manuscripts. They stare from medieval canvases. They disrupt our assumptions because they refuse to be neatly categorized. They refuse to vanish quietly. And here's the kicker. The people who wrote these maps, they weren't trying to be radical. They weren't intentionally subversive. They were simply recording what they saw through the lens they knew. Their lens hadn't yet been clouded by whiteness as ideology. It hadn't yet been reshaped to justify empire. They didn't see race the way later centuries would. They saw identity, ancestry, spiritual resonance, and they mapped it. Judah, Judea, Kingdom of Solomon. Not because Africa needed validation, not because Europeans were heroes, because belief is a map, and belief is powerful. It moves ink, it moves thought, it moves culture. So when historians try to dismiss it as coincidence, it's not just disingenuous, it's dangerous to comprehension, because the coincidence theory collapses under the weight of primary sources. Explorers' journals, missionaries' letters, atlas after atlas. They all carry the same residue of memory. It refuses erasure. And that's why retention matters in videos like this, because clarity over complexity keeps the viewer engaged. Because the human brain craves patterns, it craves causality, it craves revelation. When you show evidence that overturns what people thought they knew, you lock attention. You don't meander, you land the punches. You give the context in layers. You show maps, you show paintings, you show written testimony. Then you ask the questions the gatekeepers hope you won't. Why was this buried? Who benefited from the erasure? And what happens when the truth resurfaces? Retention spikes when curiosity drives every segment, when each revelation makes the previous understanding crumble, when viewers feel like they're peeling layers off history itself. And that's what the story of Judah on West African maps does. It's peeling layers. It's exposing the reshaping of memory. It's showing the deliberate construction of narratives to elevate some and diminish others. It's revealing Europe's own amnesia. And here's the final twist, that amnesia isn't just historical, it's systemic. It influences textbooks, museums, church teachings, popular media. It shapes perception of Africa, of the Bible, of identity itself. And yet, the evidence never really left. It persisted in art, in scholarship, in maps that survived the cuts, in manuscripts that escaped the flames, in the diaspora, in oral memory, in unexamined traditions that quietly remember. The truth is resilient, and so are the questions. When you dig, the patterns emerge. Judah on the map, Black Madonnas in churches, Enlightenment scholars noting Egyptians as Africans, Portuguese officials writing about Black Jews in Guinea, claims of Abrahamic descent along the Niger, all converging, all pointing to one conclusion. Africa was never outside the biblical story. It was always at the center. Early Europe knew it, and that knowledge was erased. But erasure is imperfect, and imperfection is where inquiry thrives. That's why history is alive, not in textbooks, not in sanitized lectures, but in questions, in exploration, in discovering what was almost lost. Which brings us to the final lesson. Maps, art, manuscripts, they are more than records. They are clues. Clues left by a Europe that once saw Africa differently. And the moment we recognize that, everything shifts. We see how identity, belief, and power intersect. We see how narratives are constructed, then rewritten. We see that history is not static. And we see that the responsibility to uncover, to question, to share rests with us. Because the people who drew those maps didn't have to leave Judah behind. They didn't have to record it. They chose to. Their choice survived centuries. And now it's ours to examine, to understand, to interpret, to carry forward. Because recognizing erased truths isn't just about the past. It's about reclaiming narrative authority. It's about understanding who we are in relation to history. It's about refusing convenience, embracing complexity, and following evidence where it leads. Africa at the center of sacred memory. Judah on the coast. Maps that speak louder than edited textbooks. The memory lingers, and now it speaks to us. If we listen, if we dig, if we refuse to accept the sanitized story, then the past stops being static. It becomes alive. It becomes instructive. It becomes a tool to challenge assumptions, a tool to empower curiosity, a tool to demand honesty. Because the maps don't lie, the manuscripts don't lie, the art doesn't lie. Only the selective forgetting does, and selective forgetting can be challenged. And here's the final truth. The ink may have dried centuries ago, but understanding, that is happening now, and it's unstoppable. Judah on the map is more than geography. It is memory. It is resistance. It is history demanding to be remembered. And when you see it clearly, you realize something profound. The story we were told about Africa, about the Bible, about identity, it was never complete. It was never accurate. And now, through inquiry and evidence, it can finally be reclaimed. Because truth has a stubborn habit of resurfacing. It doesn't care about convenience. It doesn't negotiate with erasure. It persists. It survives. It waits for those willing to see it. And when you do, You cannot look at the world the same way again, because the past was never as distant as you were told. It was always here. It was always central. It was always alive. And now it calls to the present, to witness, to recognize, to reclaim, to remember. Thanks for watching. Remember, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And prepare for the next journey into Africa's great civilizations. Because history isn't finished, it's unfolding, and you're part of it.